and 3. There was a brief moment when the product almost looked like could be a great solution. It made sense, and it appeared to be getting people to kick a really bad habit. Until people started dying. The headlines started to appear more and more often, and then all of a sudden, the victims became younger and younger. In fact, just last month, the youngest victim to die from vaping-related illness was just 15 years old. Thousands more are affected with lung illness. I remember reading a quote by Dr. Andrew Pipe, former chief of the Division of Prevention and Rehabilitation at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute and professor in the Faculty of Medicine Department at the University of Ottawa, in which he stated, "Vaping is an issue that's screaming for attention. We're seeing a public health disaster unfolding in front of our eyes." As you can guess, the topic of the podcast today is on vaping, not just for parents or for teens, but for the public at large. And I'm honestly thrilled that this Order of Canada recipient and member of the Canadian Olympic Hall of Fame is joining us today. Now, Dr. Pipe is currently involved in clinical research assessing new approaches to smoking cessation, strategies designed to facilitate exercise adaptation, and novel initiatives to prevent cardiovascular disease. He has addressed audiences in over 30 nations and is frequently consulted on issues related to tobacco use and smoking cessation, drug use in sports, and physical activity and health. So with that being said, I'd like to welcome you to Living Your Life with Lianne Laing, the podcast brought to you by Extension Marketing. And as always, please look to their website if you're looking for more information about them at extensionmarketing.com. Dr. Pipe, it is a pleasure.
Well, it's a delight to be with you.
I'm really excited, and this has been a topic I've been wanting to tackle for quite some time. Are you surprised now the amount of dialogue that we have around this subject?
Well, sadly, I'm not surprised. And I say sadly because, unfortunately, this epidemic, this crisis is entirely predictable and also entirely preventable. And the fact that Health Canada and others were advised of the need for thoughtful but forceful regulation of vaping devices several years ago and failed to introduce appropriate regulation is a cause for great concern. And so we have substandard public policy surrounding the regulation of these devices. And, it's always intriguing to recognize that the tobacco industry and understand that the vaping industry is now the tobacco industry in drag, that the tobacco industry always manages to escape the kind of regulation that thoughtful citizens would think would be appropriate. I mean, you can't introduce to the marketplace a dishwashing soap if there's evidence that some of the ingredients might cause psoriasis in 0.007% of the population. It won't happen. And yet the tobacco industry kills 47,000 Canadians a year with products when used exactly as intended. And now, of course, they're seeking to addict a whole new generation of young people in order that they can continue to reap handsome profits at the expense of the lives of young people and Canadians. So it's kind of maddening.
Maddening, absolutely. And I think of what you have done in your career and the steps that you had made, and it was almost like you're getting people off of the habit of smoking, and then all of a sudden, at this point in your career, you're having this fresh new battle ahead of you. It must be, there's almost like a sense of devastation or frustration that, you're able to get past one only to be almost like brought back to zero again.
Yeah, you're right. It's terribly frustrating. But I would say I would ask you never again to use the word habit when you talk about vaping or smoking, because that unfortunately gets in the way of our really understanding and taking the appropriate action. Nicotine is the most addictive drug we have in our community. And when individuals inhale nicotine, they're intra-arterial drug users. We get very excited, understandably, about intravenous drug users. We completely forget that the moment you put something in your lungs, it instantly goes to your heart and then is distributed via the arterial circulation to every tissue and organ of the body, and very, very rapidly, therefore, delivered to the addiction centers of the brain. And it takes exposure to nicotine by inhalation of about 48, 72 hours before you become addicted. And of course, the tragedy of teenage vaping is that they become addicted very rapidly to nicotine because these devices deliver far more nicotine than do cigarettes. And they deliver nicotine in a very sophisticated way. And so the pathway of addiction is established in the brain, and we know from animal and human models that once an individual becomes addicted to nicotine, they're far more likely to become addicted to other drugs should they be exposed to them later in life. So there are a whole constellation of problems that flow from the unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in at the moment.
Well, before we were educated, before we started to see the headlines, I remember having discussions around a dinner table at a dinner party with friends that had teenage kids, and it was more like, what flavor, did they seem to prefer? There was a time when the kids were just saying, well, it's just flavors. There's no drugs in, there's nothing in it. It's just flavored. So how did it go from them just thinking they were inhaling a flavored steam over anything else?
Well, they were incredibly naive, understandably naive, given their age and the fact that they're just learning about these things. They're also victims to all of the same kind of tactics that the tobacco industry used in the past when it was allowed to advertise tobacco products to teenagers. And so we've seen a phenomenal explosion of social media messaging oriented and directed distinctly to teenagers that perpetuates some of these kinds of myths. Everybody's doing it. These are the trendy sort of things. There are thousands of these flavoring agents. And by the way, we have no idea the impact of inhaling these flavoring agents on the lungs. But what evidence we have at this point is really quite daunting. Teenagers, like teenagers everywhere, consider themselves to be immortal, omnipotent. They're never going to die. Nothing can ever happen to them. Get off my case, Mom. It's just steam. It's got flavors, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, now they've been addicted. The industry is able to extract large sums of money out from them for years to come. And their ability to make independent, free choices, which is also something teenagers prize, has been taken away from them. So it's the same kind of pernicious and pervasive social marketing techniques that were used to market tobacco products been applied to marketing vaping devices. And interestingly, you've seen in the last week or so, the tobacco industry now come out in with full throat and have full page ads in the Citizen and the Toronto Globe and Mail, and talking about let's deal with facts, not hypocrisy. Vaping is, so much safer than, and as they recognize that regulation is on its way, hopefully. And so they're going to be doing everything they can to derail or diminish the impact of that regulation.
When we first were introduced, how long has this product been out? Because wasn't it originally almost like a way to be able to kick the habit of smoking, that this was almost like the addiction? I am not going to use the word habit again, kick the addiction. Was it not originally almost the tool that people were using to not
this was
smoke?
This was the intent, and certainly people recognize that, if we can deliver nicotine in a way that is free of the products of combustion. When you burn tobacco, you produce all kinds of combustion products, many of which are carcinogenic. So we should be able to allow or use these devices in such a way that people can get nicotine without all of these other horrible things, and we should be able to maybe able to help them stop smoking. And I understand and also appreciate that kind of approach. And I think what's also frustrating for me is the fact that our ability to use these devices for smoking cessation has really been taken away by the lack of regulation of these products. No responsible clinician is going to say, I think here's something that we can use to help you deal with your addiction. I have no idea what's in it. There's no evidence whatsoever to attest to the safety of the substances that have been added to this product. I have no idea what the concentration of nicotine is. The people that sell these products, for the most part, don't know what that is. Let's give her a go, eh? I mean that would be just reckless. And so I'm hopeful that if we did get meaningful regulation, the content of nicotine was regulated, the flavors were eliminated, and we had pharmaceutical quality kind of products, that we could then use them in a way that would help people deal with nicotine addiction. Because after all, we use nicotine replacement therapy in other forms to help people address their challenges of smoking cessation. So that opportunity, unfortunately, has also been taken away by the lack of appropriate regulation. I have physicians say things to me like, vaping is the oxycodone of smoking. And so there's such great antipathy towards these products because, doctors are parents too, and they see what's going on in the high schools and they see what's happening with teenagers. And they're also perhaps aware of the fact that by and large, vaping is entirely a behavior of teenagers and young adults. Older adult smokers are not flocking to these devices in order to be able to stop smoking. And the evidence as to what happens when they do use these devices in an attempt to stop smoking is not great. In fact, the evidence shows that an adult smoker who starts to use these devices with the hope that they'll stop smoking is less likely to stop smoking than if they'd embarked in this direction at all. And challenging and really disturbing is the analysis by scientists and researchers now that say that for every adult that may quit smoking using one of these devices, about 80 teenagers will become nicotine addicts. And that just places this whole challenge in context. And unfortunately, that reality is not necessarily, as far as I can see, appreciated by those who are in a position to introduce the appropriate policies to regulate these products.
So let's bring that in because you've mentioned policy a couple of times. What do you feel? How do you think we should be moving forward then? We're already behind by quite a bit. What needs to be installed now?
Well, I think we need to learn from our experience in dealing with the tobacco industry in the past. We know that no one single initiative is ever sufficient. All of them are necessary, but never sufficient. So I think in the case of these products, we want to regulate the content. In other countries, the concentration of nicotine is regulated. In Canada, it's a Wild West show. We want to regulate the level of nicotine. We want to eliminate the flavors unless a specific company might make a specific application to use a particular flavoring agent because it might be more attractive to smokers, a tobacco flavor, for instance.
Like a grape or watermelon or strawberry flavor.
We do not need bubblegum flavored popcorn, misty caramel. I mean, there are literally thousands of these flavors. I'm repeating myself, I know. And they have no place there. These agents are generally regarded as safe, GRAS. That's the term we use when we approve the use of these substances for application to the skin. Coconut sunscreen, for instance, right? Or when we approve their use as a food product, so coconut to eat. Nobody knows what on earth happens when you inhale coconut flavoring, right? So a classic example.
No, it's a great example.
Yeah. So we need to regulate the nature of these products. We need to regulate the marketing and the advertising of these products. We need to regulate where they're sold. We need to control the price of these products. We know that teenagers are particularly price sensitive. In terms of smoking conventional cigarettes, a 10% rise in the price of cigarettes produces overall about a 4% decline in adult smoking, but an 11, 12, 14% decline in teenage smoking. And Canada, once led the world in reducing the rate of teenage smoking, and that occurred as a consequence of appropriate pricing strategies. We need also to put on a minimum price for these devices because it's a favored tactic of the tobacco companies to lower the price of their particular products in order to make them, and of course they're making so much money in these areas that they can afford to do that. So yeah, we need to restrict the age at which they can be bought, where they can be bought, et cetera, et cetera.
We didn't. I remember going through the campaigns of the smoking, and I even remember when the gas stations. Because gosh, almost 40 years ago, I was riding my bike to the store to pick up a pack of cigarettes for my mom who smoked at the time, right?
Yeah,
and you'd go with a letter from my mom to the quickie or the Mac, and you'd send them and off you went. And then I do remember the massive transition of when the products were hidden. Yeah. We went through that. They used to have the open and the shelving, and then it became closed. And I was like, well, that was brilliant, right? If it's not always in front of you, you actually have to go ahead. So that made an impact. But now when you look at where they're targeting, it's also stuff that we're not seeing because they're on their social media. So these sponsored ads, like everything else, is finding them with an easy click of purchase here. They don't even have to go through anything. they're just clicking their phones, and the next thing they know, they've got a product.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the level of communication and the intensity of the communication that's taking place with teenagers in these areas is largely unappreciated by those of us that are old fogies, right? I mean, it's just staggering to see the kind of messaging. And of course, the algorithms that are in play in social media are such that if a teenager is clicking on one or two YouTube videos or one or two Facebook, whatever, the next time they open Facebook or YouTube, they're going to be assailed with scores of these kinds of messages. So yeah, there's some real challenges, and it. As you can imagine, having been involved in these in the tobacco wars of the past, it's astonishing to see that we failed to learn. And in particular, I think one of the reasons why we're in this situation is that the institutional memory that might have been present in, say, Health Canada has gone. And I suppose the other factor that's been at play here is there's been a fascination with and an understandable consideration of harm reduction, right? i.e., these are safe. These could be considered to be safer products. Let's try to switch people, and let's not put anything in the way of that might impede the access of a smoker, say, to these kinds of products. And so people have fallen sway or been seduced by the siren song of harm reduction. Now, I want to say I completely believe in harm reduction, right? I mean, if we're dealing with opioid addiction, we can help by using drugs like methadone or Suboxone. That's a harm reduction technique. But we don't sell chocolate-flavored, peanut butter-flavored methadone in convenience stores and gas stations. We never would have allowed that to happen. And so those who are, very vocal exponents of a harm reduction approach, I think have to appreciate that, yeah, we should be able to use these devices from a harm reduction perspective. But the failure to regulate the nature of these products means that our ability to use that in a professional sense or in a public health sense has been greatly eroded.
I think at this point, it's people having to take their own responsibility of educating, of speaking to their children. I know that you have outreach almost every day from high schools that are begging people to come in and to talk to the students. What have you heard from, I mean, I know from the medical side, but what have you heard from just teachers or schools of what they're seeing from their students?
Well, they're totally frustrated. As you say, I get invitations from high school principals. I hear concerns from parents who are just beside themselves that nobody seems to be doing anything about this. And as you know, there are high schools where all the bathroom doors are being taken off. Kids are coming home saying to parents, I can't urinate at school because if I go in the bathroom, it's just like a fog of vape, right? USB charging devices are being removed from schools because one of the most sophisticated of these devices is a product called Juul, which I would say is, outside of the implantable insulin pump, the most sophisticated drug delivery device in our community because it delivers massive amounts of nicotine very, very, very rapidly and in a sophisticated fashion. And of course, the little device that's part of the Juul apparatus, you need to stick into a USB port to recharge. So schools are removing those kinds of facilities.
But it's almost like there's like this devil at the production side of, the manufacturer going, how can we do this? I mean, to do it in a USB where the kids are carrying them and they're with them at all times, it's crazy. So with parents that know that their kid has a Juul, it's the highest concentration?
So a typical pod that's used in Juul contains as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. And some teenagers are going through 2, 3, 4, or 5 of those a day.
And yet they're thinking in their heads that they're not doing anything.
Right. And so the mythology persists that somehow, these are just flavored solutions. There's nothing in these solutions. I mean, you ask, what do I hear from students? What do I hear from teenagers? Right. Well, for what you hear from teenagers, it's, this is natural. It's safer. It's flavors. There's nothing in here. I can stop anytime I want. And so there's a an perhaps understandable naivete about these products, and of course they're fed a whole array of messages, and the messages say this is cool, this is trendy, you can do neat tricks, you can be a flavor chaser, you can be a vapor chaser, you can blow vape in huge quantities between your teeth and make unbelievable patterns. There are really nifty things that you can do, some tricks that you can do. They're vaping stunts. There's even now lines of vaping clothing, because so that kids go into the classroom with a hoodie, and the hoodie has drawstrings, but those drawstrings are hollow. So the student can use the device in the classroom and then just put the tip of the drawstring in their mouth and exhale into their sleeve or into the fabric. So go online and you see that there's now vape wear, clothing which allows you to conceal the fact that you're vaping.
I need to inhale that information for a second right now.
Yeah,
that they have, knowing that people are on the lookout, teachers, they have created a clothing line which allows them to hide the device and yet still inhale. Yeah. And that totally, brilliant. Whoever thought of that, the strings of a hoodie.
Yeah,
it's horrible. It's horrific.
Kids don't even need that. I mean, they are using these devices in the classroom throughout the day, and they have them in their shirt pocket or maybe in a pocket, and they suck on the device and then they exhale into their sleeve or into their sweater.
But they're addicted.
They're addicted.
It's not that you have this kid that's trying to be mischievous, and at this point, you're talking about 4 or 5 pods.
Well, I mean, that would be extreme, but that's not unusual. It's not atypical. And I think those that have never been smokers or never been vapors, never been smokers, have no idea how difficult it is to stop smoking. And of course, the other thing is that if you're using a cigarette, generally a smoker of a cigarette smokes the cigarette, and 25, 35, 45, 55, whatever minutes may go by before they have another cigarette. Vapors tend to be using these devices continuously. So there's no real pause in the course of a day, which is why teenagers can go through such huge quantities of these particular pods. And the other reality is that when you are using a cigarette, smoke goes off from the end of the cigarette, and so not all of the nicotine in the cigarette product, eventually goes into your lungs. When you inhale on a vaping device, the vape only goes into your lungs, your airways when you vape, and all of it goes into your lungs and your airways. So another way in which you get much more nicotine than would otherwise be the case.
Okay, don't mind me as I'm asking these questions, because I think I'm thinking of the listeners right now, or the parents that are out there. They have their child that are saying it's just flavored. At no point in there are you saying that no, in any flavor there's nicotine.
Well, it is.
Let me go through so that people can then go and look in their kids' stuff. Like, what exactly are they consuming? This podcast is brought to you by Extension Marketing. They are a new breed of marketing agency that acts as your virtual marketing department, designing and implementing cost-effective marketing strategies that will grow your business. I can speak to this personally, as I've been using the Extension Marketing team to help me launch and grow my business. Founder Pat Whalen has been a lifesaver for me, a genuine coach guiding me along the way into uncharted territory. Tell them you're a friend of the show and receive a free 1-hour consultation. Check them out at extensionmarketing.com.
There are products that are advertised as containing no nicotine, but because there's no regulation of these devices, we know that some of those products that say they have no nicotine, in fact, do have nicotine. And in fact, you understand why somebody would put nicotine in there. They want to keep people addicted and maintain it. And of course, because these products are unregulated, many of the folks that are selling these devices and the solutions also have no idea what's in them. They just buy them from an industrial supplier, and they're told it contains this or that, but that may not, in fact, be the case. And of course, these devices have evolved, and so we now are in what we call 3rd and 4th generation of these devices. And the 3rd generation devices allow individuals to fill their own tank, to make their own solutions, and to crank up the heat at which this solution is boiled or vaporized. And the moment you start to increase the concentration of various products in these solutions, and you increase the temperature at which the vapor is produced, you produce all kinds of other chemical reactions between and among the various elements that are in this solution. So I use the term a Wild West show, and because I think that accurately conveys the fact that in many cases we have no idea what it is that people are inhaling. And we saw in the United States where so many of these acute lung injury cases and deaths that a significant proportion of those deaths occurred as a result of individuals vaping marijuana, which was produced or cut with vitamin E acetate, which is used to kind of dilute the marijuana so that the dealers can make more money with less. Right? You get the picture. But a significant proportion of those deaths occurred in individuals who were inhaling nicotine solutions, and marijuana was not involved. So the fact that there's no meaningful regulation is just unbelievable, and we need the government to respond quickly and thoughtfully to introduce such regulations.
What is that going to take? A Canadian, I mean, we've already seen deaths in the United States. We see, as I mentioned in the intro, we're looking at a 15-year-old now as the youngest to die from this. Is it pressure from the public? Is it more pressure from the medical community?
I think it's all.
Where are we seeing it from? Because, I can think of any Hollywood movie, right? And you've got the NRA and you've got the tobacco industry, and there's a lot of funds and power behind those too.
Yeah, I think some of the things that you've identified are absolutely necessary. I think we need parents to speak out. I think that's really, really important.
Speak out in general, or just speak out making sure it's not happening in their own household?
Speak out in general and start calling upon our political leaders for leadership in this area, and asking politicians to overcome what seems to be an timidity whenever any consideration of regulating the tobacco industry is concerned. The scientific evidence continues to accumulate. Health organizations, I'm involved with the Heart and Stroke Foundation, Canadian Medical Association, Canadian Lung Association, Canadian Cardiovascular Society, Canadian, et cetera, are all screaming in a very polite way, of course, but all screaming for regulation. And I think it's going to be public pressure, which is going to be necessary to move our Minister of Health. Now, also, to be fair, it's important to note that provincial governments across the country are now starting to move in the absence of federal activity. So Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island are going to be banning flavors. British Columbia is raising the prices, raising the tax, reducing the nicotine concentration. But one of the worst things that could happen is that we now have a patchwork quilt of provincial legislations which differ. So there's a need for very considered but very comprehensive federal regulation.
The one thing we're looking at is the one outlook on it's the gateway. It's the gateway to addictive behaviors. It's the gateway to you go from the nicotine to the marijuana and down the list we go. But when I look at some of the things that are actually happening, the gradual symptoms that we're starting to see, difficulty breathing. We're looking at shortness of breath, chest pain. There's a couple things of vomiting and diarrhea. These are physical ailments and symptoms that are starting to appear in what was normally healthy individuals.
Yeah, and I think the idea that we're by switching to these devices we're going to dramatically reduce the harms that come from smoking is understandable, but it's also idealistic. And it's important to recognize that in the 1930s, lung cancer was an exceptionally rare cancer. Fast forward to the 1960s or to the present, and lung cancer is commonplace as a consequence of the degree to which people became smoking. Lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer death amongst Canadian women, almost entirely attributable to the fact that women were targeted by the tobacco industry 30, 40 years ago and took up smoking in large numbers. What we're seeing now in terms of vaping is the emergence of changes in lung function, lung tissue, cardiac function, cardiovascular function, just with the introduction of vaping devices, which indicate that the use of these products is going to cause other forms of health problems, other types of health problems. So my colleagues in respirology, lung specialists, now talk about the fact that they're starting to see the signs in tissue samples and others of those who vape of something we call interstitial lung diseases. And I don't want to get all technical.
No, but I find this fascinating. So they're already seeing in the tissue a change.
These are nasty, nasty lung diseases. And so are we replacing lung cancer, which is a good thing to have, to eliminate rates of lung cancer, but are we now in the process of triggering a whole new different form of lung disease, which will take 20 or 30 years to really declare itself? But these kinds of lung diseases are no less lethal and no less pleasant. They produce horrible symptoms, and so that's why we've got to be careful here in terms of ensuring the appropriate regulation of these devices.
And could you say young adults, teens that are consuming even what they think is just flavored pods, right? That they think there's no nicotine, there's no anything in them. The process of what they're inhaling and how the steam is affecting their lungs so they say they come out of this, they don't end up having addictive behavior they don't pick up smoking, they don't pick up other things, but could we see 10, 15 years down the road that what they were doing with their lungs and how much they were inhaling could have an effect?
If they continue to vape, absolutely. Right. I mean, again, not wanting to get all technical, but we know that when you vape, you produce changes in vascular function. Your blood vessels no longer constrict and dilate in exactly the normal way that they should. And this kind of stiffening of your blood vessels is a classic precursor or classic element that precedes the development of significant cardiovascular disease. We know that individuals who vape, elements in their blood are much more likely to stick together and form clots. And we know that changing vascular function, increasing the likelihood of having clots, these are the mechanism which ultimately lead to heart attack and stroke. Right? We know that lung function is affected in a variety of ways. The immunological functions of the lung's ability to withstand infection, the lung's ability to clean itself, the tissues of the lung, which are incredibly sensitive, unbelievably sensitive. They become thickened, and therefore the function of the lung starts to become impeded and impaired. So yeah, I have a neighbor who's a very practical guy, and he just shook his head one day and said, "I can't believe that nobody's doing anything about this." He said, "I put my hand in my car door and I slam it, I'm going to get hurt. Why is it that people don't understand they put superheated steam full of chemicals into their lungs and expect nothing to happen?"
Well, I feel like we were tricked. In a sense, I feel like even the conversations, I feel like people, it just at the time was this kind of new fad and no one really knew. And so you get the frustration, you get I think at this point, the anger. I think parents, okay, let me ask you this. How does a parent now, let's say we're hoping to not get our kids to start it in the first place. Sure. But we have parents right now of grade 10, 11, 12 students who have been doing this. Yeah. So what is the what to do now? How do we help them? How do we help them realize that they have an addictive behavior and then get them off?
Well, I think first and foremost, if you're not sure whether your teenager or youngster is, because
they're hiding it.
This is now in the public schools, by the way. I mean, we talk about this is a high school phenomenon. It's now in senior public school. But so I think opening a conversation by saying, "Geez, I'm hearing an awful lot about vaping and kids vaping in schools and all sorts of things happening. Is that happening at your school?" And so you begin to engage in a conversation, which can lead you to say, "Gee, gosh, have you ever tried it? You wouldn't think about trying that, would you?" And presumably that conversation can proceed. I think one of the worst things that you can do is to sort of do I don't ever want to hear that you've been vaping because it's addictive and it's going to kill you and it's going to, because teenagers just turn off. They consider them, health considerations don't mean anything to them. They consider that's don't have to worry about that. They are naive. They believe I can stop whenever I want. Just get off my back, Mom. Right? So I think it is important to try to have some kind of sensitive conversation, which also conveys that you understand that if they are using and are using regularly, that they're addicted, and that you want to try to help them deal with this addiction. I think a message that teenagers respond to is that, because teenagers don't like, is the rip-off message. Teenagers don't like being ripped off, and talking about, here's an industry of big fat cat old guys that want to suck enormous quantities of money out of you for years to come, and even at the present. And because they got you addicted, they're now controlling your life. Your ability to do what you want to do in the next 10, 15, 30 minutes is controlled by them, not by you. And starting to vilify the industry. Industry denormalization is the term that's used in the tobacco control world, can be very successful. And indeed, the kind of the public health messaging around vaping and around smoking that has proven to be most successful with teenagers tends to be industry denormalization. Getting teenagers themselves mad about what's being done to them is probably important.
That
here.
they've taken away their choice, their free choice that they thought they had.
Yeah. Addiction is the complete antithesis of freedom of choice. Right.
But that's an interesting way of changing your thought process as to how you're going to deal with your kids.
Yeah.
to vilify the tobacco industry, or to have the conversation say, I think you're addicted to this. But as there would be with smoking, how then do you? So say you have the conversation and your kids are like, yeah, Mom, I've read the headlines. I'm starting to see that it's not so good. But they're already in this behavior. So similar to, I know you've worked with thousands upon thousands of patients to get them to stop smoking. What is the...
Yeah.
How do you get them off of it?
Great question. And unfortunately, because of the rapidity of this phenomenon, there isn't a whole lot in the literature about how you help teenagers deal with addiction through vaping. I think what we want to do is to apply some of the lessons and what we know from helping smokers. It becomes more challenging because we know that among the most effective ways to help people stop smoking is to use pharmacotherapy in association with some support and strategic counseling and encouragement. That can become problematic because teenagers don't necessarily always take medicines when they're prescribed. And there may be a reluctance on the part of parents. Geez, my kid's now got to take medicine to help him deal with this addiction. But I think we're going to find that that's going to be one of the paths that we're taking. So I would have no qualms about using even other forms of nicotine replacement therapy in teenagers to try to help them deal with this, or other medications.
It's almost like I would think you're almost going backwards.
Well, you're not going backwards.
Like if you think they're going on,
but they're going to get infinitely less nicotine than they get via inhalation. They're not producing stratospheric surges of nicotine in their arterial circulation. This is nicotine that's delivered in very low amounts, slowly through the venous system, absorbed through the skin or the mouth. And the whole idea is that you provide a certain background level of nicotine, which is sufficient to curb the craving and the discomfort that accompanies the withdrawal, which teenagers experience, right? I mean, they're sucking on these devices. They think it's because, oh, geez, might be a nice time to, but basically their brain is saying to them, suck on the device or I'm going to start to make you feel uncomfortable.
All right. So, and I understand the addiction, but the habit. So the same as they pick up their phone 1,000 times a day, right?
Yeah.
Like that phone is in their hand.
Yeah.
It's attached to them, right? So I try to take the phone away. It's like no phone for a while.
Yeah.
And I can sense their the gravitation to it. I'm assuming the same for an individual who's constantly got the device
1,000 times worse. Right. Now the habituation of having a phone is very different than addiction. And that's why it's so important not to use the word habit. Because a habit is something that, it's part and parcel of a routine and we feel a little bit unusual when we're not able to do that. An addiction is when, in the absence of a drug in your brain starts to go haywire. And as a consequence, you feel very, very uncomfortable and very unpleasant. And until you get that, right? You know, you get diarrhea, you get cold sweats, you may become nauseated, you get headaches, you get all of these sorts of things. None of those things are happening if you don't have access to your phone for an hour.
Okay, so I think that's a really good wake-up call for parents to think, I'm just going to grab their phone. Like, if I'm just going to take away their vape, the same as I would take away the phone. It is nothing.
And if
There's
you
no
think,
comparison
no
whatsoever to
comparison.
thinking that it's a similar
And
punishment.
if you think you're taking away the vape, let me break some news to you, right? These devices are small, they're easily concealed, they're et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you may think you got the vape, but it's quite likely that somebody who's craving and needing, as a result of their addiction, this drug has got other sources and other supplies and other access. You know, what's staggering, though, because your comment about we're going back to the reminds me that there's now good evidence that many Juul users, recognizing the need to get off Juul and finding it incredibly difficult to do so, are actually switching to smoking.
Oh my God.
Because it's easier to quit smoking than it is to quit juuling.
I feel like I could cry for these individuals to have the feeling that in order to get off the vape,
yeah,
I'm gonna.
I mean, and it's certainly not something I'm not even advising. I mean,
no,
but
it's
it just allows us to understand the dimensions of the problems that we're facing and the problems that have been unleashed as a result of the failure to regulate these products. And of course, now that the tobacco industry is behind them, you know, Juul is 35% owned by the Philip Morris tobacco company, and the senior executive at Juul is a guy that was parachuted in from Philip Morris. In his whole deal, his whole reputation has been that he's the guy that knows how to ensure that no meaningful regulation of Philip Morris's products ever occur. All right. So I mean, I do not.
How does one become that kind of an individual?
Well, I don't know. And you know, I have a friend who's in a business school, in a very well-known business school. And I said, you know, we got to start thinking about how we can come into business schools and talk to people who are doing their MBAs and saying, how in good conscience can you ever find yourself going to work for a tobacco company, right? I mean, what did you do today, Daddy? Well, you know, I increased the sale of a product which is going to take 10 years off my customer's life and cause incredible damage and destruction and expense to our healthcare system, right? 30% of the people in our hospital beds today would not be there if they weren't formerly or currently smokers, right? And yet this is an industry that continues to escape regulation. And they're very tricky, right? So many provincial governments are suing the tobacco companies for the cost of treating their customers. What did the tobacco companies do in Canada? They declared bankruptcy.
I didn't know that. You talk about going into an MBA school and talking to these individuals. What are you doing right now to the medical students? How are you having this discussion in the classroom now with probably students who might have even tried some of this when they weren't?
Well, they may have tried, but you know, one of the challenges in terms of speaking to medical students today about smoking cessation and tobacco related issues is that none of them have ever smoked, and so
the next generation, it's
this
ingrained in us, right?
This is where we want it to be, and so they have difficulty understanding how complex and how challenging smoking cessation can be. Nonetheless, we try to address that. But you know, when I talk to them about the battles that I've been involved in over my life, right? Getting smoking out of airplanes? What you mean they used to allow people to smoke in airplanes? They can't even understand that. Smoking in bars and restaurants? I mean, you know, I let you in on a little secret. One of the most brutal, if that's the right term, kind of fights or battles that I was involved in was getting smoking out of the surgeon's lounge at the Heart Institute. I mean, when I went to medical school, lecturers had a piece of chalk in one hand and a cigarette in the other. And we were always greatly amused when they got, those things mixed up. But we have to remind ourselves how prominent and dominant smoking was in our society, and we looked at it as if it was normal. And when you think about it, what's normal about lighting things on fire or heating things and then sucking them into your lungs?
Well, it's true. I remember going through all of the process of seeing it coming off airplanes, seeing it come out of bars, seeing all of these changes. And you're right. The younger generation never grew up being around cigarettes. And I think for a lot of people who were young, who were part of the parents who did smoke, who have all quit, it was so gross to us that it was just like, I remember she smoked in the car and I'm like, I will never do this. This is the most disgusting thing ever. So we had the reasons as to why we didn't. And this generation doesn't have that.
And I think the sentiments of parents that you've expressed are very, very powerful in terms of ensuring that we get an appropriate government response to the vaping issue, because
we're that generation.
Because you are
we're
that
the parents
generation
of the kids that are doing it. You're right.
You're ticked, right?
I am.
Why are my kids being exposed to this stuff? We had made so much progress, and now because of government failure of government oversight, we got this problem. And it's time somebody did something about it. And Member of Parliament, I want you to make sure that your government's working to do this. I mean, I would very, 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 very much encourage parents to start to become far more vocal, not yelling at their kids, but yelling at the politicians that got us into this mess in the first place.
Yeah. The thing is I think a lot of people don't know. As you said, they're so concealed. I've had a lot of friends, they didn't know that it was, that they needed to have the conversation. I've had the conversation, right? Because and I don't think Andy's going to throw me on the bus for this one, but she went to a sleepover and, it took a little bit of time, but a couple weeks later, she's like, Mom, I need to tell you something. I tried. She goes, there was nothing in it. There wasn't anything. It was just a strawberry flavor. But she's like, I've had this tremendous guilt and I just wanted to let you know, and I'll never do it again. Yeah. But I didn't know, you think you know everything that your child is doing. And I'm grateful that she was honest in her, couldn't hold it in. But they're being concealed. People don't know that this is actually happening. And that they're, they think that their kids got a USB, and that, if they're naive or they're not educated about this or they're not aware, it's happening underneath their noses.
Yeah. And your comment about the strawberry flavor and so on, the industry knows that what is most attractive to teenagers are the flavors. And true confessions, I mean, my own teenage smoking behavior was very much driven by flavor. There used to be products called Old Port cigarillos, which were wine flavored and rum tipped, and they had this delicious flavor. And, I can tell you that I got hooked on that stuff. I didn't realize it at the time that I was hooked, but I mean, I look back, and fortunately I was an athlete, and, I kind of suddenly realized, geez, this was the last thing I needed to be doing in terms of whatever. But the whole flavor deal is exactly what makes these products so attractive to teenagers.
I want to bring in the athletic part. I mean, your background is amazing, and you're working, and you continue to work with elite athletes. Have you encountered any issues with our athletes who might not have thought when they started to do this, that this is happening, or the education is enough at this point?
Yeah, no, I haven't. Well, let me roll back the reel. I really got first involved in tobacco issues, apart from a clinical perspective, when we wanted to get rid of tobacco sponsorship of sport. Right? Because tobacco sponsorship of sport was huge. And those of us that were involved in sport, and particularly those of us that were clinicians, said, this is absurd. This is insane. And so the tobacco industry used all of its tactics,
They sponsored tours. I mean, everything. Golf, tennis, everything.
Well, that's what they said. They said, listen, if you take tobacco sponsorship out of sport, there'll be no more tennis in Canada. There'll be no more curling in Canada. Spruce Meadows will disappear. How will the Canadian ski? Right? I mean, all of this total crud. Right. And anyway, that's how I got involved, and then obviously it grew from there. But to come back to your question, no, generally athletes, they're very well aware of, and they're so concerned about performance and their own health and their own level of fitness. They want to accentuate fitness. They don't want to impair it.
I think they're educated now. I read some of the stories of some of the American kids who, I don't know if they were as far in, but had been athletic and had been runners and had done things, and then all of a sudden, they're lying in a hospital bed. It's just it breaks your heart to see some of these stories that have actually come through. So I know that we've got school boards that are putting on information nights. You've got things that are happening. So as much as the information that's coming in, it's the outcry and the public support, the public talking to politicians or to getting this, aside from just speaking in their own homes.
Yeah, absolutely. A very great German scientist, biomedical scientist, many, many years ago made an observation which is now legendary. There are two causes of disease. One is pathological. The other is political. Because the failure to introduce appropriate public policy or to have substandard public policy leads to considerable disease. And to come back to your point, what's needed now is for parents who are concerned to express that concern in a straightforward, sustained manner to their local member of parliament, to write letters to the Minister of Health, to ensure, and all of the public polling. I saw some stuff from the Angus Reid polls of last week or so. The public is overwhelmingly on side in terms of supporting these kinds of regulations, and which makes the sort of the inertia or the indifference that is present at the government level all the more frustrating.
It's just different. I remember the smoking section at high school. You had the goths, the kids that were dressed in black, and that's who you saw. Those who were out in the smoking section, and now you just see. Not even standing outside doing this, but in school bathrooms at every school across the country that are dealing with this.
And in dressing rooms between periods in hockey rinks. And I mean, the degree to which...
Okay, well, so let me ask you this. If we're you're saying it's happening in between periods.
Yeah.
So these kids who are playing sports.
Well, yeah, but I misunderstood your question about elite athletes. Right?
Okay.
Right,
so, but you have kids that are playing high school hockey
they just right there.
They're vaping in between.
Yeah,
periods.
And again, because they need to, in the sense that now they're addicted to nicotine, and so they're, yeah. Absolutely.
You must have a coach scratching their head as they walk in to go out.
Yeah, I do. I mean, and I hear, just as I hear from irate, frustrated high school principals and high school student parents, I hear from individuals in community sports saying, what on earth's going on? Why aren't you doing something? I mean, I get, it's hard to me to convey to you the ferocity of yesterday, somebody in our staff said, we've got this call from so-and-so, 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 who's a parent from somewhere, someplace, and she will not talk to anybody but you. She demands that we provide, you've got she has called multiple times, and she wants to know what you are doing, about this. And I can understand her frustration. So I will be speaking with her, but it's staggering to see what's happening. I suppose in some ways it's encouraging that parents are getting as concerned as
involved
as we
are. Well, I think for the parents that I knew who were purchasing these pods at this store have stopped at least the purchase, or how the funding as to how these kids are getting the money to do that. But a lot of them have jobs now. They're using their money to be able to do that. So how did you say it? The villainization, is that the word?
Denormalization.
But to vilify. There we go. Yeah. To vilify
the industry.
The industry is to express that industry is taking away their power, their choice.
And there's one other thing we haven't even talked about.
Now go.
Yeah. So in terms of Juul, for instance, these little devices, they're electronic. And so when they're used up, you've got an electronic device containing a pesticide. Now you've got an environmental issue. And because these devices are sort of shiny and small and glittery, they're also attractive to children. So now one is hearing reports of children who are collecting these things, picking them up in the school, kids as young as 7 or 8. And so there's an environmental issue, to say nothing of a risk of poisoning, because kids put things in their mouths. So there are so many dimensions to this issue that and this came as a revelation to me in the last 3 or 4 weeks as I learned more about this kind of challenge. So there are dimensions to this issue that...
Do you walk into the office that day and kind of say, I've got enough on my plate as I'm trying to battle health policy, Health Canada, government politicians, my patients that I'm still trying to be able to, quit smoking and do all this. And then all of a sudden you get a piece of paper on your desk that says, hey, by the way, Dr. Pipe, we've now got this issue, and small kids are inhaled, like they're putting it in their mouths. Like, do you kind of just toss your hands up and pull your hair out?
Well, I certainly pull my hair out, and yeah, I use the word infuriating, and I use that deliberately. I mean, there aren't flames coming out my ears, but it is. There's a phrase from the 60s, right? That if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And I always remind myself that unless you're working to kind of address this, you can't be indifferent. You can't be silent. You can't just sort of throw up your hands and say, "Oh God, what?" I'm obviously, my professional orientation is to the health of my patients and the health of my community, and therefore one wants to speak out and try to be as constructive as possible in terms of addressing challenges which affect the health of my patients or my community. And this is an enormous one.
Because I'm looking at the time and I have to go, I want to just give parents one final checklist as to how they can kind of go. Let's have the conversation. Is it talking with your family doctor? Is it where are they going to be able to aid, at least start within the family? What is their checklist of things, and how do they move forward?
Well, I think having a sensitive kind of conversation with a teenager, and that can be a challenge in and of itself, right? But also emphasizing that you understand that this is addictive, and that addiction can be very difficult to address. Seeking some help from a family physician or a local public health unit who have smoking cessation programs and so on, reaching out to those individuals, getting some advice, and being prepared to recognize that treatment in the classic sense might be necessary to help individuals deal with this addiction. At the same time that you're having that conversation, I think it's also important to be having conversations with others, particularly members of Parliament, members of the provincial legislature, dropping a note to the Minister of Health, asking for the kind of regulation which we know is going to be necessary to address this issue.
Okay, I'm sorry to ask this, but if you're having that conversation and you're getting as many infuriated calls from teachers and principals, and is there things or programs that can be done in the schools that there's almost like a program for those that are dealing with it? And if there's a student in a class who's opting not to go and grab their vape, but that there's almost a program in place in the schools. Well,
that becomes a very difficult challenge, because I think people in the schools and educators would say, geez, I have enough on my plate without now starting to basically get into clinical practice in terms of trying to help people deal with addiction. But
they're taking doors off of the stalls in the bathroom. That's already happened.
All they're trying to do is, not trying. What they're attempting to do is to obviously minimize the likelihood of use of these products in the school setting, and hats off to them for doing that. But your suggestion is intriguing.
It's happening most of the time. That's where they're spending most of their day. They're there from 9 until 3, right? So
and I'm I can't point to any particular program or experience but I think examining the opportunities that might be afforded in those settings would be very worthwhile. Again, our response and our failure to be able to respond as effectively as we might is due to the rapidity with which this whole phenomenon has fallen upon us.
Do you see an end? We saw it with smoking.
I'm always
optimistic?
I'm always an optimist. It can take one heck of a long time. It was it's been something like 25 or 30 years before Canada got to the point that we have plain packaging of tobacco products. And in fact, that was an idea that was first voiced in Canada by the Canadian Medical Association. It just shows you how long it takes to get those policies in place. Meanwhile, other countries sprinted ahead, took our ideas, and Australia, used them. And so the leadership that we once demonstrated in Canada through Health Canada in terms of addressing the tobacco epidemic, we've kind of fallen down. We're dropping down the league. We've dropped the ball, and we're behind, and that's revealed in terms of our failure to have responded to the vaping crisis.
Really appreciate the time. Best website? I mean, is there stuff at Ottawa Heart? Is there just public health? I mean, I went and vaped, and 1,000 things came up on Google.
Yeah.
But there are places, public health?
Yeah, public health and Public Health Ontario, I believe. You got to be careful that you don't inadvertently, once you hit vaping, you're going to be led to all kinds of vaping sites and vapors' rights organizations, which are, there are at least 4 vapors' rights organizations in Canada, most of which are funded by the tobacco industry or are led by individuals who have vape shops or supply vape chemicals. And the disinformation and the disingenuity of their messaging is in some ways sinister. As much as it's disappointing.
Well, I feel enlightened a little bit. I'm hoping that this has helped other parents or, to have that conversation, and teens, and even those that are, thinking that they're doing one thing, and then the realization that it's completely different. And thank you for the work that you have done. The lifetime of work that you have done is really making an impact on so many Canadians. So it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming in. And thanks to everyone for listening to yet another episode of Living Your Life with Lianne Laing. As always, please, if you can, subscribe, share, comment, let people know the topics that we have, the types of guests that we have on the show, and really helping people make the decisions to live their best lives every day. Have a great day, everyone.